Hey, how's it going? In today's video, we're going to be talking about the Boruto timeline. We're going to be addressing how time manipulation works, the specific characters who have been using time manipulation abilities, and we're also going to address the worst possible future that Boruto and Kashin Koji have been actively fighting against. This video will contain major spoilers for the Boruto manga. You have been warned. With that being said, let's get started. Time is a very fragile thing in the Naruto universe. Not only is it constantly moving forward, but it's also ever changing. This is not due to coincidence, but rather through the actions of several individuals in the series. One change, no matter how big or small, can alter the course of history for better or for worse. The notion of predestined fate has been thrown out the window because now the characters are in the domain of gods. They have the power to choose the future they want. While I do believe the Naruto and Boruto timeline is in a fragile state, the anime and even the manga have laid out the rules for how time travel works. As of the recording of this video, there is one and only one timeline. This timeline has a beginning and an end, and technically speaking, there is no real multiverse right now either. Unlike other franchises like Marvel or even Dragon Ball, time manipulation, or more specifically time travel, in the Boruto series does not create a new but separate timeline. It simply affects the already existing timeline. The time slip arc in the anime is the perfect example of how time travel works in this franchise. Now, some may debate the canonicity of these events, and that's fair. But keep in mind, the intent of the anime was simply to be created to expand on the existing story of the manga. But I think this expansion is way deeper than we originally thought, and I'll elaborate what I mean by that further as we progress in this video. So getting deeper into the time slip arc, when Boruto and Sasuke went back into the past to save Kid Naruto from Urashiki, one thing was for certain. Boruto and Sasuke had to hide their true identities from everyone in this era. Now, why would they need to do that if they went to a different timeline? Boruto and Sasuke masqueraded as street performers because they knew if their identities ever got out, this would have dire consequences for the future, their future. This is why Jiraiya asked Sasuke to erase his and Naruto's memories at the end of this arc. Naruto, but especially Jiraiya, knew too much, and they literally fought against an alien, which is life-changing in itself during this early era in the timeline. It's like Kashin Koji said in Blue Vortex chapter 13, intel is key. If you know something is going to happen a certain way, you'll adjust your behavior and actions accordingly to deal with this situation. The characters knowing about their destinies prior to major events occurring would have led to drastically different results in the present. Let's take Sasuke for instance. He could have been in a circumstance where he still remained in the darkness and alone. If Naruto knew too much about the future, it's more than likely he would have made different choices, and this would have eventually gotten him killed in his fight with Sasuke in the final valley for the second time. Meaning, Sasuke would have ruled the shinobi world as a tyrant, and Boruto and many others would have never been born. Another consequence of this, if Sasuke won, this would have led to the darkest timeline that Boruto and Koji were fighting against. This would have manifested as well, because this version of Sasuke would have had no allies, and he would have lacked the power needed to stop threats beyond Kaguya like Ishiki. Jiraiya in the time slip arc definitely figured out Sasuke's identity. It's very likely he also figured out Boruto's identity as well as being the descendant of Naruto. Both Sasuke and Jiraiya decided to play dumb, but the fact still remains they did this in order to protect the timeline. Imagine if Sasuke had told Jiraiya how he died against Nagato. Then Jiraiya having intel prior to his fight with Pain likely would have led to him surviving that encounter. You have to recall, it was Jiraiya's lack of understanding of the Rinnegan's abilities that ultimately led to his defeat. And Jiraiya surviving would have been awesome, yes, but a major consequence of Jiraiya's survival would mean that Kashin Koji would have never been created, since Amato would not have access to Jiraiya's DNA in the Hidden Rain Village. And without Kashin Koji, then the darkest possible future would have definitely come into existence very early on in the Boruto era. Are you guys starting to see how slightly messing with time could either make the timeline better or significantly worse? Now that we've addressed that there is only one timeline, let's go over the Otsutsuki clan and more specifically the powers associated with time specifically. So first, let's talk about Ada's Senrigan. This is a dojutsu she essentially received from Amato after being modified with Shibai Otsutsuki's DNA. This gave her the ability to use clairvoyance, which allows her to see into the past and present. There are some limitations to this ability, however. She can only focus on something she wants to see, and she can't see everything in the world at the same time. Plus, she can only see events from the past from the point where she was alive for it. Kashin Koji also discovered he had awakened a Shinjutsu by also receiving the same DNA as Ada. Koji inherited an ability called prescience, which I will elaborate on further in this video. I also believe Boruto, or rather Momoshiki, has a variation of prescience, which is the Shinjutsu. However, unlike Koji, Momoshiki's Byakugan is needed and required for its activation. Urashiki is quite literally a time traveler. His blue Rinnegan allowed him to jump a few moments in the past. This allowed him to experience the future moments before actions actually occurred in the midst of battle. And let's not forget the time slip arc and how Urashiki used a device called Karasuki to travel back in time. And this was a device that was stated to be something the Otsutsuki clan invented. So they're no strangers to time, as you've noticed. There is a pattern here. So now that we've established that there's one timeline, and we've also established different methods for how characters can potentially manipulate time, let's now go over each character that has specifically messed with the timeline and altered the events of the story to work in their favor. Boruto chapter 75 is called The Domain of Gods. This was a chapter where we learned about Shibai Otsutsuki, Amato's motivations, and the concept of Shinjutsu. Momoshiki in this chapter states to Boruto that he knows all Shinjutsu, and Momoshiki also confirms what Amato said about Shibai Otsutsuki being true. The chapter's title has a double meaning because not only does it address a new realm of power with Shinjutsu, Boruto himself also taps into this domain of power. Near the end of this chapter, Boruto unintentionally activates Momoshiki's Byakugan and begins to see events that haven't occurred yet. He sees the Hokage's monument, where he learns about the fate of his parents, Kawaki's betrayal, and this is where he also receives his scar. He then sees Team 10, and more specifically, Shikidai is scolding someone in a first-person point of view, and then he sees an angry Mitsuki, and Boruto has no context for these events. And there's even a panel where Kawaki has his Karma version 2 activated, which didn't happen in the official part of the story. This is something a subscriber of mine pointed out, so shout out to that person. What I believe happened was Boruto tapped into the Shinjutsu prescience, and this is what Momoshiki was using all along to manipulate the events to assure that omnipotence would occur. Momoshiki saw visions in part 1, and unlike Boruto, he trained himself to interpret these visions. In Boruto chapter 78, Kawaki was backed against the wall. He was essentially done for since he was low on chakra and was surrounded and apprehended by different leaf shinobi. But Momoshiki does something that was always suspicious to me. He allowed Kawaki to escape. I believe that Momoshiki used prescience and likely saw multiple outcomes from this chapter, and he knew he had to intervene so that his desired outcome would occur. Otherwise, the course of history would have changed. Momoshiki wanted a future where Boruto was in despair so that he could forever take over Boruto's mind and once again regain a second life. This explains why Momoshiki was so angry in chapter 80 of part 1. Momoshiki made a mistake, that he entered a future where he essentially succeeded. He overestimated his understanding of the future and he underestimated Boruto's resolve. I believe what he experienced was a concept called resistance, and this is something I'll be diving into much later in this video. Kashin Koji is the most recent example of someone who has been manipulating the timeline. Despite being a non-Otsutsuki, Koji understood the concept of probability. Like Momoshiki, Kashin Koji is a gambler. He knows the stakes, he knows all the factors that can and will create the darkest future, and he is actively working to tweak events so that the future flows in a more positive direction. Koji also understands that one small change can cause a ripple effect, leading to multiple other changes. Koji understands the concept of the butterfly effect. Every decision in the series moving forward can and will lead the characters closer or further away from the darkest timeline, because everyone is interconnected in the story, and one person's actions can and will affect other people. And just like Boruto experienced in chapter 75, where he saw Kawaki activating Karma version 2, which didn't happen, Koji also saw something we as fans know for sure did not happen in the story as well. Koji saw the birth of 5 Shinju, with the 5th Shinju being a doppelganger of Gaara's adopted son Shinki, which is impossible because in Blue Vortex chapter 4, Boruto and Code essentially witnessed the birth of 4 Shinju. And people took this scene quite literally. As far as we know, Shinki in this current timeline may have not even been eaten by a Clawgrime and turned into a tree. The point of this panel was to show the idea that anything and everything can or will happen. Kashin Koji in Blue Vortex chapter 13 breaks down the concept of decision points to Boruto. These critical points in the story have the ability to either lead the world closer to the darkest timeline or postpone those events. Koji uses the example of Boruto himself as a person who needed to make a decision point for drastically altering the future. In Boruto chapter 78, Kawaki was going on a rampage and had no problem with killing whoever got in his way from killing Boruto. He warned Sarada to stand down, in which case Sarada refused. Boruto had reached a decision point as Kawaki was preparing to kill Sarada and was presented with 2 options. Option 1, Boruto trusts Sarada to essentially dodge Kawaki's attack. And then there's option 2, Boruto pushes Sarada out the way and she doesn't get killed. This in turn led to different potential futures. The future we saw in the story is where Boruto chose option 2. Boruto got his scar and Sarada lived. And then Omnipotence was eventually casted. But had Boruto went with option 1, Sarada would have been killed and Kawaki would have then proceeded to kill a distraught Boruto. And Koji points out, Omnipotence would have never been casted if this future came into existence. But Code would have successfully sacrificed Kawaki to the Ten Tails, thus bringing in the darkest timeline. Another branch decision occurred during Ishiki's conflict with the main cast. This decision point was reached after Naruto entered Baryon mode, and that essentially ran out. And this is when Ishiki pulled Kawaki into Momoshiki's dimension by using his chakra connection to Naruto. Sasuke had bought Kawaki time to hide from Ishiki at this point. And this is where Ishiki reached his own decision point, just like Boruto did in the previous example. Option 1, torture Naruto and force Kawaki out of hiding to save his precious Hokage. And then there's option 2, kill Naruto and force Kawaki to be broken mentally. But option 2 presented a risk to Ishiki. Kawaki may have had the chance to still remain in hiding, and Ishiki was low on time, so was he really going to risk that? So Ishiki fortunately chose option 1, leading to Kawaki tricking him with the Shadow Clone, and Ishiki ended up dying. But had Ishiki decided to go with the other option, Kawaki would have been mentally broken, and then Ishiki would have implanted a new karma onto Kawaki, and Boruto would have been eaten by the Ten Tails. As we learned from Kashin Koji in chapter 13 of Two Blue Vortex, in most potential futures, everyone dies because the divine tree gets planted on Earth. This is the worst possible future or darkest timeline. Due to multiple variations of this outcome, the probability of the dark future occurring is actually very high, regardless if it's Boruto or Kawaki that gets eaten by the Ten Tails, which heavily implies this is the destiny of the Naruto universe and how it essentially is going to end. And I'll eventually get into why there's still some hope to save everything. 2 years before Jura was even created, Koji explains that Jura would be the one to kill Boruto in a potential future. Now, if this was one specific future, I don't think Koji would have brought this up to Boruto. I believe the probability of this occurring was extremely high because it took place in multiple futures. Boruto's survival in this current timeline solely depended on him working with Koji. Kashin Koji in turn saved Boruto's life because those techniques that he essentially taught Boruto had been impossible for Boruto to learn, and thus making it a scenario in which Jura had to essentially spare Boruto's life. Jura also reached a critical decision point in chapter 13, which would have drastically altered the timeline. Option 1, kill Boruto because A, he knows too much, B, has the power to actually stand up to the Shinju, and C, can use the flying Raijin to constantly escape capture. And then Jura had option 2, leave Boruto alive because Hidari 1 needs to be revived right away before his soul bulb rots, and 2, because Boruto can lead Jura to find the real threat to his plans, and that being Kashin Koji. Jura choosing option 2 meant that the probability of Kawaki being eaten has somewhat decreased, and the future still has a chance to be better. Taking it back to Blue Vortex chapter 4, Koji telling Boruto to escape actually makes a lot more sense now. Koji likely already saw the outcome of Boruto's fight with all 4 Shinju. While we did see Boruto holding his own against Matsuri, Mamushi, and Hidari, Koji knew the potential future where Jura kills Boruto was at an all-time high and could have easily came into a reality if Boruto remained in Ishiki's dimension, so Boruto had no choice but to leave. This also makes sense why Kashin Koji in chapter 9 was certain that Boruto would lose control when his karma seal was activated. Koji likely already saw a potential future where Kawaki and Boruto were fighting, and this obviously is where the karma resonance occurred like it did in the actual story. And so Boruto had a decision point, but Koji chose for him, and that's why Boruto left the battle. But let's say Koji didn't intervene, and Boruto doesn't leave like he did in chapter 9 and continues to fight Kawaki. This would have led to Momoshiki taking over Boruto. And Momoshiki taking over Boruto means that the darkest timeline would have occurred even sooner. I am sure that Momoshiki in control of Boruto's body is beyond the power of Jura himself. Boruto has shown to be around Ishiki's level in his base form, so you can imagine how strong he would be if he has control of his karma like he did in part 1 of the series. Momoshiki killing Jura doesn't mean the Earth is safe, because Momoshiki is not a hero. Momoshiki would actually be an even bigger threat and likely would sacrifice Kawaki to the other Shinju remaining, and thus creating a chakra fruit. Thus, the end of the world would have happened anyway. Koji's plan to prevent the darkest timeline ties into Boruto. If he can manipulate one of the variables in the equation, he could potentially produce a better timeline. Koji had the brilliant plan of using prescience as a means to see alternate future versions of Boruto and teach the current Boruto useful techniques to keep him alive. So Boruto in present day should actually not know the Rasengan Usuhiko this early in his life. And this was a technique he defeated Hidari with, something that forced Jura to retreat. Boruto also shouldn't know the Flying Raijin, but since he does, he can be there at a moment's notice to any scene and essentially prevent the darkest timeline from occurring because he's actually strong enough to stand up to the Shinju. Boruto is Kashin Koji's knight. Boruto learning the Flying Raijin must have come from a timeline where the events of chapter 78 transpired differently. We have to keep in mind that Koji started to see the future 30 chapters prior to the events of chapter 78, and he saw many different outcomes. I believe Boruto knowing the Flying Raijin came from a future where Kawaki failed to kill Boruto and was apprehended by the Leaf Shinobi. The major difference in this timeline being that Momoshiki did not help free Kawaki from Shikamaru's Shadow Possession Jutsu, meaning omnipotence doesn't occur in this timeline, potential timeline, and Boruto doesn't become a rogue ninja. And there's plenty of evidence in both the anime and manga that showed that Boruto had a great respect for his grandfather Minato. Due to Boruto still being in the village in this possible future, it's likely that this version of Boruto would eventually go on to master this technique and likely used as a method in his rematch against Code. It's also likely he got help from the 3 remaining Jonin who were still alive, who were able to use this technique or found a hidden scroll and learned it that way. I believe Boruto learning the Rasengan Usuhiko comes from another potential future, one in which the events of Boruto chapter 80 diverged from what actually happened. This time, Sasuke was the one who had to make a critical decision. Option 1, does he listen to his daughter and save Boruto? Or option 2, does he follow his understanding of under omnipotence and essentially continue to hunt Boruto? We know Sasuke chose option 1 in the story, but it's also very likely he could have chose option 2 as well. I think the Uzuhiko is from a future in which Koji saw that Sasuke decides to essentially not listen to his daughter and continue to hunt Boruto. And in this future, Momoshiki helps Boruto escape from Team 10, not Sasuke. And I believe Boruto eventually runs into Kashin Koji 3 years earlier in this potential future, since Boruto wouldn't have an experienced shinobi like Sasuke to keep him safe for a year and a half. The nature of the Uzuhiko uses natural factors similar to Kashin Koji's Flaming Mountains technique that he used against Ishiki. It would make sense if Koji helped Boruto invent this technique in a possible future. Neither technique relies on the user's own chakra, but rather their affinities for wind and fire styles respectively to weaponize natural elements. And I believe one of the biggest branch decisions comes down to none other than Toneri Otsutsuki himself. Just like the other characters mentioned, Toneri had a choice. Option 1, involve himself with the events of Earth, or option 2, simply observe how things would play out. To this day, I truly believe Toneri's interference is why the anime and manga are similar, but they are also very different in a lot of ways. I believe the anime and manga are in fact following the same timeline. However, due to the butterfly effect, things are different in certain areas. Both are equally canon, but they are also both possibilities in which the timeline could take. It's heavily implied early in the Boruto anime that Toneri is the one who manipulated Boruto's body to awaken the Jogan. Boruto should have never unlocked this eye naturally, but due to him inheriting Otsutsuki genes from both of his parents and also being a major player in stopping the darkest timeline, Boruto was the perfect candidate for Toneri to work with. Just like Koji and Momoshiki, I believe Toneri also used prescience to a certain extent to see the future. Toneri likely saw different realities as well, and thus his decision point lied in him either getting involved or not. And I believe in the anime's continuity, he did get involved. But just like Kashin Koji, Toneri tampering with events also caused a butterfly effect to occur in the anime, as certain events were inconsistent with the manga. Let's take Boruto's friends for instance. Boruto has way more friends in the anime than he does in the manga, with the exception of a brief cameo from Metal Lee. All we really got was Ino Shikacho and Team 7. No one else. I don't think the other characters exist in the manga at all. And characters such as Denki and Iwabe, who are a part of Metal Lee's team, I don't think they were ever born. Boruto befriended Denki first if you watch the anime, and without Denki in the manga, Metal Lee likely never became Boruto's friend. And if you notice, Metal Lee never interacted with Boruto in the manga, and we don't see his teammates either, which further supports this evidence. Same goes for Sumere's squad mates, or even Sai's students that became Anbu in the anime. I believe either they weren't born, or they either chose different paths in life. While Sarada's character does remain consistent between the two mediums, her development as a shinobi has diverged between the anime and manga, especially when it comes to her shinobi class and her Sharingan development. Sarada in the anime has yet to unlock the 3 Tomoe Sharingan, yet in the manga she already has it. Both the anime and manga depict her as being the one to destroy Boro's core, and you would think by this time in the anime that the staff would have given her the 3 Tomoe Sharingans, but she still doesn't have it. What makes things even stranger is her status as a shinobi. In the manga, Sarada never makes it past the rank of Genin, as Shikamaru states this in 2 Blue Vortex Chapter 1, and Random Jonin mentioned that Sarada was still a Genin in Blue Vortex Chapter 2. Yet in the anime, Naruto is the one who promotes her to Chunin after her performance against Chocho in the second Chunin exams. Even Kawaki was affected by timeline alterations. In the manga, yes, he learned basic ninjutsu from Naruto, but never once has he expressed interest in becoming a shinobi. If anything, he showed nothing but disdain towards their methods and how they got things done. Yet in the anime, it's the exact opposite. Prior to him reawakening his karma seal, Kawaki is actually grateful to Naruto like in the manga, but he actually opens up to more people, and due to the butterfly effect, I believe, this is what causes him to want to become a genin, to follow in Naruto's footsteps. To even further point this out, Kawaki in Two Blue Vortex doesn't even consider himself a shinobi. Even Boruto points this out in the manga that essentially Kawaki needs to become a shinobi one day, and that's when he could return his headband to him. Yet in the anime, we clearly saw him going on missions on behalf of the Leaf Village. He actually grows as a person until his karma returns, and then he takes 20 steps backwards at that point. But Toneri's actions didn't just affect the characters in the Leaf Village, it affected villains as well, because you got characters like the Inners from Kara, Olga and Deepa, for instance. These were characters that don't exist in the manga at all. Yet their Roman numerals imply that these were members of Kara because they filled those missing slots from the Kara members from the manga. I believe these two characters died earlier than they did in the anime in the manga's continuity, but due to the butterfly effect, it extended their lives. The way Olga explains her backstory in the anime, Jigen was the one who essentially killed her in the manga's continuity. But due to the butterfly effect, not only did she survive Jigen's attempts to essentially murder her, she also got to meet Boruto. And it would make sense of how Deepa died in the manga. We have to keep in mind in the anime's continuity, Victor and Deepa were working behind Kara's back to essentially do experiments in artificially creating a chakra fruit. So let's say in the manga's continuity, Deepa and Victor got exposed for their experiments a lot sooner. However, Victor threw Deepa under the bus, and therefore Deepa was the one who was killed instead of Victor. And Victor still dies at the hands of Kashin Koji because, of course, Amato and Koji were tying up loose ends because essentially they wanted to get rid of Ishiki. But due to the butterfly effect, Deepa ends up surviving much later in the series and ends up fighting against Team 7 and loses miserably in their second encounter. And then he gets killed by Amato, which of course is consistent with the timeline in which Amato wanted to essentially tie up loose ends with Kara Inners. And Urashiki is the one who proves this to be true. Notice how he never appeared in the manga, yet he was clearly present in the anime when Momoshiki came to Earth. While Urashiki kept up the persona of being a typical Otsutsuki in front of Momoshiki, it's clear he was there for an alternative motive. Urashiki is a very weird case because in some instances, it's clear he wants to preserve the timeline. That's why I suspect he didn't get involved when Momoshiki and Kinshiki fought Naruto, Sasuke, and the other Kage back in part 1. He has space-time ninjutsu with his red Rinnegan, so he could have easily been there and joined that battle. What's also suspicious is that he is very familiar with the timeline because he already knew Boruto was Momoshiki's vessel, but Boruto never used his karma against Urashiki, nor did he witness Boruto get implanted with the karma. So how would he know that Momoshiki took Boruto as his vessel? Then you have other instances where he is actively going after Tailed Beast. He went after Shukaku, but you could argue that he went after Shukaku because Shukaku doesn't have any major involvement in history in the Boruto era specifically. But then he goes back in time to essentially try to capture the Nine Tails from Kid Naruto. And that's a red flag because the timeline would be drastically different if Naruto died. But I guess this would also lead to the darkest timeline anyway because Naruto's not there to prevent things. Then if you compare Momoshiki's reaction to seeing the Jogan to Urashiki, there is a lot more suspicious behavior. When Momoshiki sees the Jogan, he looks terrified, shocked, and angry. But when Urashiki sees the Jogan, on the other hand, it's quite a different reaction. He recognizes the Jogan right away, but then he proceeds to smile. I think he's confirming to himself that yes, Boruto was the anomaly all along in this timeline. And he was also confident because he knew Boruto didn't know the true capability of that eye. Urashiki likely never showed up in the manga because in the manga's possible future, Toneri never messed with the timeline. This would also imply that Urashiki is from a different point in the timeline as well. And Urashiki was there strictly in the Boruto era to deal with Toneri because he noticed that things in the timeline were changing. And that's why he sealed Toneri, to prevent any more interference with the idea of the darkest future coming into fruition. So it's essentially been up to Koji to stop all of this madness. And I think Koji's biggest enemy in the series is a concept called resistance. I believe time itself is actually fighting back. And even though events are playing out differently, history is still trying to correct itself. That's why the anime and manga are similar yet still different. There are also some notable differences in the current timeline in the manga. We saw 4 Shinju were born instead of 5, but the Shinju were still born, however. And Boruto was supposed to get killed by Jura, but thanks to things getting changed around, that was not the case. But I believe time itself is still heading towards the darkest future regardless. Aside from Boruto, I think Kashin Koji is relying on time anomalies in order to create new variables to deal with the threat. Boruto, for instance, was surprised that Jura was after Himawari, meaning that the timeline had changed to a point where she actually became a Jinchuriki. I don't think this was something Kashin Koji predicted, but it was a welcome benefit, because it's clear as day as well that Himawari is walking down the footsteps of her father and will likely become a great hero in the shinobi world. Boruto also wanting to team up with Code in chapter 4 is another anomaly. This is likely something that does not happen in most timelines. Code was either eaten by his own claw grime or was killed by the Shinju in these potential futures. And I believe he is the key to weakening Jura. And I don't think this is Kashin Koji's mistake. I actually think this is Boruto's mistake. In my opinion, keeping Kawaki alive is going to be a big factor in leading to the darkest future. Kawaki is the key to bringing the destruction to the world. And in most futures, Kawaki is the one that gets eaten, according to Kashin Koji. Boruto in chapter 13 says that no matter what, he's not going to kill Kawaki and he wants to restore the Uzumaki household. In my opinion, this is a foolish decision. Boruto is stronger than Kawaki. He could cast Genjutsu on him to release Naruto and Hinata and then seal Kawaki away. He doesn't necessarily have to kill him, and he could save billions of lives. But Boruto still hopes that he can essentially bring things back to the way they used to be. Even if Boruto and the others successfully defeat the Shinju, who's to say another butterfly effect won't occur to lead Kawaki down a path where he decides to destroy the shinobi system? Because time itself is always going to try to correct itself. Toneri's words to Boruto makes a lot more sense now, that the eye is the star of hope against the destruction that's coming to pass. It's not the Shinju or even Kawaki that's the problem. I believe it's time itself that has decided the world should end. I don't think the Jogan Eye itself has the power to stop events from playing out. However, I do believe the Jogan is the key to connect Boruto to an infinite power source. That source being Shibai Otsutsuki. And since Shibai would be an all-powerful entity and likely wouldn't care if Earth survives or not, Boruto may use this power to rewrite the destiny of his world. And this will end the concept of resistance and save everyone.